It's been a new day for pastor groups. You have a menu of for pastors in terms of which group they want to be a part of. And but when you use the word cohort, usually we're talking about a learning community for church leaders. Pastors or church leaders that are in a cohort, it's much more than support and encouragement, which is always a bottom line to a group. But as John and Derek and Jason showed, we always have to keep learning, whatever the resource, whatever the perspective, keep growing. And we're talking in particular how we do that in disciple making as leaders. Jim Harrell is with us, and he's a president of Overseed, a ministry that equips pastors and leaders in church revitalization. And he has an expanding network of pastor cohorts in strategic areas across New England. And I have a question for him about his cohorts in light of our discussion about disciple making. And that is basically what makes for a cohort that is effective in helping church leaders begin to think and work through disciple making as the core of church life. Let me ask that again for all of us. What makes for an effective cohort that helps church leaders, pastors and church leaders, bring disciple making into the core of church life? Jim, you've been involved with cohorts. You train coaches, you train cohort leaders. What are some things you would say that really make a cohort experience effective in bringing learning and growth to leaders? Could you answer that for us?
Sure, thanks. It's great to be here. I mean, in one sense, disciple making is not rocket science, but it's not easier either. And it's particularly given how many different church cultures we have in New England. So we have found really 4 things that kind of have helped our cohorts be effective. I think one is there's just a group discussion time where you can talk with your peers. In a sense, discovering the language that helps you communicate to your church what you're trying to do. And that kind of cross-pollination between your peers, we've found very helpful. I think secondly, it's got to be intentional. And so each of our members of our cohort takes on a yearly project. How are we going to move disciple making forward in our churches? You know, whether it's evangelism, whether it's small groups, pathways to ministry, leadership development, you know, how are we going to keep making disciple makers in our church? And it begins with a good assessment. And so we use an assessment tool, but you know, this whole idea of intentionality, but then you got to combine the intentionality with accountability, because we all know life just takes over, and the greatest priorities we had easily drift in the chaos of life. And so we add an accountability section to the group where guys come back and report on, okay, how are we doing in managing the project? Are we making progress? And kind of building in a feedback culture. You know, here's what we think of your idea, or here's a question for your idea, or here's another idea to add to your idea. So, and then lastly, just mid-course correction. Whenever you lead a new initiative, you don't know what you don't know. And so you need other people to help you learn what you don't know so that you can make the most progress possible. So those are 4 things that we have made a part of our groups: that group discussion with your peers, a yearly project, accountability, and then helping each other make mid-course corrections.
Great. Hey, that puts some things together, Jim, to start spelling out what a cohort is versus a pastor's group. We know there's pastor groups that have great commitment to other core values, unity, support and encouragement. This is a commitment to becoming more effective as a pastor and church leader in my context, in the ministry God has given me. Do you find pastors are taking to this? Where's the struggle points with this? The way you described it, it just seems sort of like, hey, it's just kind of unfolding and it just happens. I would think there's intentionality to it, but also, are there difficult or struggles or challenges with that kind of learning experience?
One of the things that we bring in is we bring in an experienced coach, so that there's somebody leading the cohort who's been down the road of how do you move a church forward? So ours are around revitalization, but it's regardless of the starting point. How do we move that church forward? And so we've got a coach who can lean into that, both in terms of guiding the conversation and then actually being directional when needed in order to move the thing forward. Obviously, you got to be willing to be vulnerable. Being a pastor is vulnerable anyway, and when you're around your peers, sometimes it's hard to admit things are hard, and so there just has to be a willingness to be who you are so that you can get better at what you do. And then I think just realizing it's hard. Moving the church forward is just hard, and that's okay. God has called us to be a part of this wonderful entity called the church, and leaders are not more important than anybody, but they're critical because the church doesn't move forward without it. So kind of embracing leadership, embracing, the call to be a pastor, and then allowing your peers to both encourage you and challenge you to keep pressing toward the mark.
Yeah, so good, Jim. I think that's so vital to pastors. And it goes back to your first point, that pastors have a safe place to be real and know realistically this is a challenging thing to be pastoring, leading, for church leaders too, to be trying, in our case here, as we're thinking about disciple making, how to inculcate and embed disciple making as the core calling and essence of a church. That's going to take time, and that's struggle, trial and error. So to be with others where you can be processing, talking out loud, but really being helped to move. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. And I think that I wanted Jim to share that because many of us are involved with cohorts, but it's one question to ask yourself as you're thinking about disciple making is, do I need to place myself in a learning context where I can continue to really work with that? People like Jim, by the way, Jim's information will be in our chat room. So if you want to be in touch with him about his cohorts, you can go ahead and do that. And there's others here that are involved with cohorts as well in different networks, denominations right here. So we realize there's a large menu right now, not just Jim, there's a large menu, but I think there's points where we want to distinguish what's a cohort, because a cohort usually says in our language, I'm intentionally wanting to grow and become more effective in the ministry God has called me to be. So thanks a lot, Jim.